Okay, the meeting is being recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings, and start by taking apologies which I've received from Kate Nicholl and Michelle McIlveen. Happy to note any others. Declarations of interest, members. Any wish to declare at this stage? None. Chairperson's business. I just want to formally welcome the joint concurrent meeting and again thank the Area Committee for hosting the recent event at Balmoral Show. We'll move on to item 4, members, which is telecommunications, joint Ofcom DERA and DFE evidence sessions. Officials from Ofcom, the Department for the Economy and Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs will provide oral and written evidence in respect of matters relating to telecommunications, including data coverage for businesses and access for vulnerable customers, and refer members to the Clerk's note at page 2, briefing papers at page 11, 20, 30, 38, 42, 47, and a clarification email on mobile coverage from fibrous and cable items. Can I welcome to the committee Jonathan Rose, Northern Ireland Director of Ofcom, Jerry McQuaid, Director of Telecoms and Internet Security at Ofcom, Kieran McGarity, Director of Economic Infrastructure at the Department for the Economy, Trevor Forsyth, Project Manager for Project Gigabit DFE, and Jason Foy, Director of Rural Affairs at the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. Colleagues, you're all very welcome. Thank you for taking the time, and I'll hand over to you at this stage.
Thank you, Chair, Joint Chairs. Thank you for the invitation today. As I said, my name is Kieran McGarry. I'm the Director for Economic Infrastructure within the Department for the Economy. I'm responsible for several areas within the department, including city deals, investment zones, and airports and telecommunications. The joint committees have been provided with a briefing which I hope you find addresses the areas you raised following your meeting with Fibrous Networks, and has been helpful in providing the information to you as requested. These are just some brief opening remarks and are designed to set the context of the department's role in relation to telecoms and to summarise the actions we have taken following Storm Eowyn. And my colleague here, Trevor Forsyth, who is the project manager for Project Gigabit. Trevor was previously the project manager for Project Stratum. If I can turn first to Storm Eowyn, as the committee will be aware, according to the Met Office, this was the most significant windstorm for Northern Ireland since Boxing Day in 1988. Over 300,000 homes and businesses across Northern Ireland lost electrical power. Met Éireann issued orange and red weather warnings on the 22nd and 23rd of January. Predicted impact of the storm was such that on the 23rd of January an emergency alert text message was issued by the UK government alerting the public to the danger of life of the storm. This was the first large-scale use of SMS technologies for such a message. You'll note from the briefing provided the department's telecoms role in relation to emergency response is limited. Our responsibility is in the provision of broadband connectivity where it is not commercially viable. We identify and break down barriers to support investment in mobile networks and also the management of public funding, such as Stratum and Gigabit. This has been provided by the UK government. The wider issues around regulation, maintenance and quality of telecom services are the responsibility of Ofcom, who are obviously here with us today and who we work very closely with. Fibrous, from who we received evidence in the previous session, secured the contract to deliver the Project Stratum on behalf of the Department and BD UK, who are the primary funder. That contract was to provide the telecoms infrastructure to enable access to improved broadband services to 80,000 premises across Northern Ireland. Fibrous advised at the peak of the storm over 40,000 of its customers were impacted, with over 2/3 of those being power related. As you're aware from your meeting with Fibrous, they faced a number of challenges in restoration of connection to their customers, including ensuring their staff could operate safely, which required working with NIE in relation to electrical safety, DFI in relation to road clearances. Other issues include the availability of mobile services so their engineers could communicate effectively, and Fibrous drafted in additional staff from Cumbria to assist with the restoration of power and telecoms connections, and reallocated staff from business as usual activities to directly support the company's response. By the 27th of February, Fibrous advised that they were back to business as usual for their customers. As well as having their own telecoms infrastructure to deliver services, Fibrous also make use of infrastructure such as poles and ducts provided by Openreach. We know that Openreach declared an embargo or matters beyond our reasonable control situation almost immediately after the storm hit, and this meant that the normal service level agreements would not be fulfilled. The embargo was subsequently lifted on the 10th of March. Since the storm in the department, we have contributed to the National Post-Incident Review Report that has been compiled by the Electronic Communications Response and Resilience Group. That is a group that is chaired by DCIT at Westminster. The lessons learned from this report are expected to focus on the standardisation of information gathering and sharing and making information more publicly available, and importantly exploring if there are opportunities to develop mutual aid across UK and Ireland. That report is expected to be finalised in the next few months and will help inform our own departmental review. As part of our own response, we have been engaging with colleagues, including Ofcom and BT UK, to help inform if there are changes that could improve the Northern Ireland response to a major event such as Storm. We have also engaged with BT UK to determine if there is scope to strengthen the procurement contract that would place additional obligations around communications on any future provider for Project Gigabit. However, BT UK's advice is that adding contractual obligations could potentially conflict with regulatory work that's carried out by Ofcom, and would mean that the service provided under subsidy would be operated under different terms and conditions than commercially provided services. We've also engaged with the Irish Government to determine if there are lessons to be learned from their response to the storm and how it was communicated to customers. The Minister also recently met with Ofcom to discuss the resilience of the communications networks and responsibilities during emergency events. In conclusion, the Department has undertaken a number of practical steps in relation to contingency planning. This will include reviewing storm warnings and seeking information from telecoms providers on their expected and actual impact. This will allow us to escalate information to the Minister and the Civil Contingencies Division. We will also use our representation on the ECRRG group to seek formalisation of these arrangements and ensure that consistent information is provided in a timely manner. Thank you.
And thank you always for coming along today, and thank you for you and your colleagues' work over recent weeks and months. I think the storm is a learning curve for everyone, particularly for me, not to store my election posters in a shed that blew away and went round all my neighbours' gardens who are certainly not supporters of mine, so that was a good crack. Can I just ask you in relation to lessons that are learnt from Project Stratum, which obviously was a hugely successful project, but now that we're getting into the final stages of procuring and awarding Project Gigabit, is there any lessons from that in terms of worst case scenarios that we may need to learn?
I think the challenge is that the contract that is awarded for Stratum and the contract award for Gigabit is a BDU contract. Okay, it's a contract that is applicable across the UK. As I said earlier, we did seek and press BT UK. Can we, because just in the timeliness of responses, can we add additional obligations onto that contract? And their advice was that, again, in terms of subsidy control and other sort of issues, that was not possible. So it's their contract moving forward. I think we will be looking from the lessons from the ECRRG from Westminster to see how we can improve our engagement with telco operators across Northern Ireland to ensure that the information that we receive, or more importantly, that DCIT receive, is communicated down to us. Because the issue, our relationship, as you know, is only with the infrastructure provider, not with the retail providers. Yes. And that presents a challenge. But we would, again, it is about, we have built a good relationship with Fibrous. It is a good relationship. I think that they recognise from, I think, their evidence to you that they could improve the communication, and they're certainly very open to us in terms of how they're moving forward in terms of improving that engagement with the department. So then in turn, the department through the Minister and other fora can communicate more effectively, I think, to the wider public.
Just to our friends at Ofcom, in terms of Northern Ireland's 5G / mobile phone internet rather than relying on the Wi-Fi network, how do we compare in terms of these islands, both with the Republic and mainland GB, about our availability of network coverage?
Thank you, Chair. Certainly in relation to 4G, Northern Ireland has benefited quite a bit from the shared rural network project. It has met all its obligations back at the end of last year. Our coverage is comparable to other parts of the UK, and I think our briefing paper that we provided will give members more detail of the precise numbers. But certainly there's a range of 4G coverage between the operators, but between them all they are up to 85% of the geographic area of Northern Ireland, and that may improve slightly over the next year or so. But certainly it is comparable. But we also appreciate that there are gaps in places, and there are parts of the country where 4G and increasingly 5G coverage is available, but it can be patchy and it can be unreliable, and it can affect what people can do with their networks. And certainly as a regulator, what we're trying to do is make sure that people have more information and precise information about the level of coverage that they can expect from any particular operator in their area. And that's one of the things that we're trying to overhaul at the moment. We have an online checker which we're upgrading and will be relaunched again in the summer, and it'll provide much more precise information so people know exactly what they'll expect from their provider.
And in terms of providers of both broadband and mobile network operators, there is a requirement upon them to provide some form of backup, isn't there, to consumers in terms of outages?
Yes, I mean our priority is really to try and protect vulnerable consumers in the event of an emergency like a storm, and make sure they have as much connectivity as possible. So we have a rule, as part of our general conditions, that there must be a backup supply of a means of making a call in an emergency that lasts for at least an hour. Now, a number of operators are providing a service that lasts well in excess of that, but that is the bare minimum, and our priority is that is for vulnerable customers, so that should be available free of charge for vulnerable customers.
Every network provider currently provides that in Northern Ireland?
Yes, and it really is in relation to the switch off of the PSTN, the old copper network, and the move to fibre.
All right, Chair, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for attending. Now, I've listened as carefully as I could to what you were saying, Mr. McGarty, there, about engagement with the Department and the Minister. That's fine, that's good. The principal problem that I was having, along with others, was engagement by the companies with their customers. At times it was absolutely abysmal. It was a case of, first of all, people not being able to get through, and secondly, being provided with factually erroneous information. So what have you, because the contract, you're all aware of the contractual obligations, by and large it seems to be going grand and going good. You'll be aware of the more intricate details of the problems. Is there anything you need to share with us about that? Are there other problems you need addressing? And what have you as a department been doing to say to the contractors and the likes of Fibres, look, you need to up your game here, because it is part of the contract, good customer services. And it was, in some cases, far from being good, some cases very, very poor.
So again, just to confirm, and you're absolutely right, that there was, on occasions, a poor quality of customer service, no doubt about it. The department's relationship with Fibres for the infrastructure. So we put stuff together. The customer retail bit is nothing to do with the department. Our contract is with the infrastructure.
Well, I get your contract, but is there not part of the contract that specifically refers to customer services?
No, because the infrastructure provides, the contract that we let is to provide infrastructure, who then let it on to a mobile or telco operator. That's their service level agreement, whether with any other operators is able to use the infrastructure we have put in place.
Well, just to get it clear, I thought I had read somewhere that the contract, the Project Stratum, was a part of that was providing good customer services.
So the infrastructure that our Project Stratum was putting the infrastructure in place that allows then a telco.
Yeah, we're wanting to see that they have service systems in place to provide services, but the relationship we have with Fibres is with the wholesale provider, the infrastructure provider. The wholesale provider then has a separate relationship with the retail service provider.
I get that, Trevor, and I've met you before, and thank you for your interventions before. What I'm talking about is it's public money that was going in, pretty extensive public money from both departments. See Jason over here going into it, but from what I can recall anyway, part of that was that there would be, as part of the Project Stratum, that there would be good, effective customer service. Now, I'm not talking about the relationship between the department and the service providers. I'm talking about the relationship as part of extensive public money's been spent on the scheme, that at least people could expect good, reasonable customer service.
So we have a balance probably to strike here, in that if we were to seek to impose additional obligations on that part of the operations, that makes the regulation of that slightly different to other operators and separates it. And that might not, that's a real balance we've got to try and strike. So I say, well, have we got the resources to do that regulation when we've got a perfectly good regulator who can look at how those conditions are handled on a general basis across that apply to all retail service providers? And we wouldn't want to be seen to be differentiating them, because the risk could be that the amount of money that it takes to run and maintain the project increases, the number of, and the provider may have to bear additional costs in that, and that's something we've got to look at. And we also were looking at this from the terms of, we were working to a standardised contract administered by BD UK. They said that were the terms and conditions, and that's what was being looked at and maintained at. So those dictate what the conditions and key performance indicators, let's put it that way. We've been looking at those, and we noted that during the storm, those indicators did drop, but they then picked them up. We've also to bear in mind this was an exceptional storm. I think they talk about since the big wind of 1820 is the other thing when it hit the island of Ireland. So this was something that was unforeseen, hadn't been factored into plans at that stage. So we're trying to learn from that as well to see, well, can we? Are there things that we can do additionally that are better for consumers? And Fibrus themselves have acknowledged that their communication could be improved, that they could have been maybe faster in making people aware of what things were happening, but that was the retail service provider side of things. You talked about having difficulty in getting in contact with Fibrus as well. We understand that during the storm, the peak time it took for them to respond to inquiries, they were saying was on average 10 minutes. Now, I know that probably the people who maybe were dissatisfied with that were waiting for 20 and 30 and 40 minutes. I've seen some of the social media.
Maybe a day or two.
You know, and if there are individuals, we would hope that they have complained about that to Fibrus as well through their complaints process. Again, we'd probably also be looking to see if Ofcom might have any comments about the customer service response at that level.
Yes, I would appreciate hearing from yourself, Jonathan, Chair, with your permission, because what about public representatives having to wait a day or two before they get a response on behalf of the customer? So, but Jonathan, maybe could you elaborate a wee bit further on that and maybe see how we can have a positive outcome to better customer services and better responses? Now, we're obviously going to be facing, Trevor, into more of these types of situations with climate change, so
we acknowledge that, and
yes,
even, well, as mentioned in the report, so far the Climate Change Committee, the UK National Climate Change Committee, has identified that extreme weather events to hit the UK and the British Isles seems to be more focused on flooding incidents is what their concern is. It's only more now recently it's been temperature increases. So extreme weather is one of the areas, but that's where they've said they think that's where more work needs to be done on trying to improve telco's resilience responses to those types of events.
Okay, thank you. Through you, Chair, I'll just pick up the point that Trevor made about the rules that are in place for telecoms companies. So they're called the general conditions, and the rules that we set for every telecoms company in the UK, whether you're a wholesaler or a retail provider. And they cover a wide range of subjects, everything from customer services through to how companies provide access to each other, to their networks. As I said, it applies at a retail and a wholesale level. So those already apply to Fibrus. So as a trading retail or wholesale company, they will be obliged to follow those rules. Those are the rules that Jerry and his colleagues will help enforce when it comes to looking at how the telecoms industry is behaving. Obviously, we can look at particular cases and extreme cases like Storm Eowyn and see what we can learn out of the back of that. Worth noting, actually, that next month we're bringing together the telecoms industry, government, and various local bodies and agencies to have a look at a number of issues to do with telecoms in Northern Ireland, primarily to see how we can get Northern Ireland even better connected. We are incredibly well connected in some areas. But one of the areas we're going to be looking at is what we can learn from the impact of the storm. We'll cover a whole range of subjects, but certainly Fibrus, like every other telecoms company, are already covered for customer service obligations under the general conditions.
And do you oversee that?
We do, yes. Those are our rules that we set
And
for every telecoms company in the UK.
Can I ask, Noel, obviously the next question is coming, what oversight have you done then into the storm with how Fibrus handled it?
Well, I think we would take a view on how any telecoms company has behaved based on the evidence in front of us. So that's something that's an ongoing matter, and something that certainly in relation to the storm, We have had several conversations with Fibrous and with our colleagues at DFE and with other providers as well to try and gather a complete picture, because it was a hugely challenging situation for all the providers.
I reckon, Jonathan and Chair, I'll wind up on this because there's one element that you missed there in who you're having the dialogue with. That's the consumers. Is there a consumer body? Is there a consumer body that you've liaised with, or consumers, or people making complaints to you? And is there a body of work that you're doing currently about this? And if so, when will that body of work conclude? Mm-hmm. And likewise for yourself too, Trevor. You mentioned there that there are issues and there are opportunities and things you could look at. Is there a time frame by which, or is there a body of work that you too as a department are looking at and saying, these are issues which we could look at, these are issues how things could be improved, and the method by which they can be improved?
Yes. At a national level, there's a post-incident review report being compiled by the ECRRG. When that's been finalised, that will then feed into our own departmental report that we are working on and finalising, and hoping to take lessons learnt from that. We've already implementing some of those already, following on from that, and the summertime gives us an opportunity to check that they are effective before a storm hits next winter. And we'd hope to have that probably over the summer, early autumn is when we'd hope to have that ready.
In the public domain, that'll be publicly available? Yes.
I see no reason why it wouldn't be made available. Yeah.
Yourself, Jonathan, and Chair, I'll finish at this point.
Yep. Through you, Chair. Yeah, we talk to customers every day. Patsy, my last call with a customer of a telecoms company was about an hour and a half ago, trying to get them to
presumably
find
it wasn't about the storm, Jonathan.
Well,
what I'm trying to get focusing in on that point.
Well, we gather information from customers. We've had complaints to us about lots of issues in relation to the storm. We gather all that evidence and we consider it in the round. So we are constantly talking to customers all the time, and it is one of the main sources of evidence that we have if we decide to pursue an investigation against any particular company that we regulate. We've got to have the evidence, and the vast majority of that will come from customer experience. I don't know, Jerry might want to say a wee bit more through you, Chair, just about the ongoing discussions of the storm and reviews of that.
Yes, so thank you, Jonathan, Chair. So we are reviewing with ECRRG. We are an observer member there. We get incident reports. Operators are obliged to report to us when they meet the incident reporting threshold, so we do get those. And we use them to inform our future policy moving forward. So we don't have an operational role, of course, during the incident itself. And it does have to be of to meet the threshold. The urgent reporting is within 3 hours, but typically is 72 hours and beyond. So we are not getting in the way of the response and the recovery. We let the operators recover their own networks themselves, but we do talk to them afterwards, and we do deal with them, and we do deal with the incident reports that come in.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thank you.
Jonathan?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks very much for coming along, gentlemen. So Fibrous had indicated that they had made extensive use of the OpenReach physical infrastructure, and the reason for that was to ensure then lower costs in terms of installation of broadband, and thus driving down the cost for the consumer. So obviously the infrastructure received a lot of damage during the storm. So can I ask Ofcom if they believe that the BT OpenReach infrastructure is fit for purpose, given the likelihood of more than once in generation storms?
I might say a few words and pass to you. Thank you. Yes, certainly we kept a very close eye on what was happening with OpenReach's network. OpenReach has benefited from quite a long experience of dealing with incidents like this. I appreciate not necessarily on the level that we had back in January, but they have a pretty good muscle memory as to how to respond to storms. And there's also there's quite a good local element to this for Northern Ireland, so we have a slight advantage in that we have a single energy or electricity infrastructure, and actually NIE Networks and OpenReach worked very closely during the course of the recovery of the storm, so it meant that OpenReach were able to establish when power was restored to a specific area before they sent out a team of engineers. So that's a really good example, I think, of local working. But the scale of it, I know from talking to Openreach a couple of days after the storm, when we had an industry gathering actually in our office, you know, when they were sharing the fact that if they got a call to a particular part of the country where telecoms infrastructure was down, and they thought it was one telegraph pole, and by the time they got there it was about 10 or 15, and you know, there were power lines down as well, and there were trees and so on, and it was a really, really complicated recovery. So certainly I think they benefited from their experience in terms of recovering from the storm.
So do you think it's fit for purpose?
I think any telecoms infrastructure literally has a tipping point. I mean, about 70 miles an hour is the point at which a telegraph pole is going to struggle to survive. It is worth pointing out that we have a particular vulnerability, if you like, because 10% of all the telegraph poles in the UK are in Northern Ireland. It's covering 3% of the population in the UK. So we are particularly reliant on overhead.
That would lead you to conclude that we are more exposed than other parts of the United Kingdom for that very fact?
Yes, yeah, we are.
Okay. So it's obviously a lot of the complexities of the complaints that we had as elected members largely focused upon fibres, which then led to the direct comparative, and I'm talking about comparative between even neighbours in terms of speed of response. Mm-hmm. Can the department advise, if based on the evidence from this storm, that they would have been better to award Project Stratum to BT Openreach rather than Fibrous, and reduce the risk associated with having a multi-service sort of approach?
It went through an open procurement. Stratum was publicly advertised. It went through the procurement. CPD advised us on the whole procurement and managed the procurement for us. And there were multiple bids received through that process. The process was deemed to be fair, and the result of that was that Fibrous put in the best bid at that time. So whilst it might, on hindsight, is wonderful, we've got to base on what material was presented to the evaluation team at that time, and the assessment was based on the material that was provided.
Would significant weighting have been placed on the cost, as I say, the bid cost, over other factors, for example? What's the weighting?
There was something like 20 criteria that were being used to evaluate, and that one of that included the coverage that was being made available. Costs, it came down to sort of how many premises could be connected with the funding that was available. But we also had to balance that against other factors, such as how the network was actually being built, the technical attributes of the network, how was the project being financed as well. Did they fulfil all the criteria that was being looking at, things like social value, where they had the back office systems in place as well to run it. So there were a wide range of criteria, and when the criteria was all summed up and evaluated and assessed, the outcome was that Fibrous had the better bid.
In light of the evidence we have now from the storm and going forward to other significant projects like Gigabit, etc., would you accept that in assessing any future bids for any future projects, that we must take into account the level of service provided post events like this, to ensure that, yes, on the face of things, initial costs for a bid can show difference, but in the longer term, is it providing best not only service but only costs in terms of what the cost would be to repair infrastructure down the line? Would you accept that perhaps gives a different light on how you would assess bids in the future for any future projects?
At the moment, we are relying on a contract that is set by BD UK, and the funding mechanism and the scheme is run by BD UK. Were we to differentiate from that, we would have to step out of that scheme and that support And then there's a whole risk as to whether capital funding for the project would necessarily be provided. So we're constrained by sort of saying, well, we think that's the best and effective way of trying to get improved services in this particular space.
And finally, from me, I think one of the key points that needs to be taken away from this as well, and probably directed more to Ofcom, is the ability to target vulnerable customers. We had a number of events right across our constituencies where particularly vulnerable constituents did not have adequate information to begin with on how they themselves could be protected and protect vulnerable neighbours and loved ones, and I think that's something that really needs to be taken up by Ofcom going forward.
Thank you, Chair. May I just respond to that briefly? It's a very fair challenge, and I think if you look at the energy sector, there are quite a number of vulnerable customer registers, and as I understand it, I think they're being consolidated in Northern Ireland into a single register. We talked earlier about the switch from copper networks to fibre networks, and one of the real focuses on that project has been trying to identify vulnerable customers to make sure that they are not switched before they're ready, essentially, and they understand how their process is going to work. So I think that has actually helped develop a much better understanding amongst the providers as to where their vulnerable customers and who their vulnerable customers are and the nature of the vulnerability, because obviously, as you appreciate, that can change over time. So I think we're in a much better place, but it's a fair point. It's one of the things we'll be looking at.
The example was generators, for example, and to be fair to NIE, when you made them aware, a generator was made available, and that was very, very well received by the customer and the vulnerable customer. But often some of these very vulnerable constituents, some of them don't know to make contact in the first place. Their telecommunications are down, they don't have access. Yes. So it's very difficult for sometimes them to reach even ourselves to then liaise with the likes of NIE. So I think there needs to be a more proactive way of managing that relationship.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Declan?
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for your presentation. Just on the follow on from Jonathan's question there about the infrastructure. One of the biggest challenges, one of the challenges that certainly I found during Storm Eowyn was almost like a standoff between different agencies as to who would deal with an issue. Particularly, I had situations where trees were hanging on wires, and BT wouldn't deal with it, Stratham wouldn't deal with it, Road Service wouldn't deal with it. And I didn't know who the landowner was, so it just hung there, So should there be like a better arrangements or agreement in place that whenever that's drawn to the attention of whoever, that there's an agreement reached till sorted before? It'd actually been sort of quicker if the line had broke, which then would have caused more and caused more of a cutout, a blackout.
I can go from the department. It's a very practical, and we should be adopting that approach, and that's something we can pick up with civil contingencies at a wider TO, because it affects power, all sorts of utilities, road infrastructure, and access. And of course, no bones about this, communication can always be improved, and that's the issue. And identifying those with responsibility to take the action quickly, rather than arguing about whose responsibility. But there are multiple partners, private landowners. You can imagine the multitude of individuals. Now, in no way minimises the impact that's having, but it's just the challenges around that. But we can certainly pick that up in terms of better coordination. As you know, our focus was on the in terms of fibres and its response. But we can look at that and bring it up to civil contingencies folk.
I know NA Water's not in the room today, but just when generators was mentioned, one of the challenges we had was that the generators were out in the pumping stations, so people were out of water as well, because NA Water had generators in hand, and that was something that probably they need to have a contingency for in future, so that if the electric goes out, that they should have generators on hand to get to the pumping stations. See, in relation to the, there's in previous evidence sessions it made reference to that 25% here haven't got access to 5G mobile services. Do you know, is that how does that compare, say, for across the water or down south?
On 5G mobile, do you want to go ahead, Tom?
Yes, thanks, Kieran. Sorry, I think that was in relation to a comment that Fibres had made about a quarter of customers couldn't access mobile. But I think, as we identify in the briefing paper, that was they were talking about a very specific situation where it was their customer base and it was people who were in a power outage. Actually, the 4G coverage figures for Northern Ireland, again, they're in the briefing paper, and they are comparable to other parts of the UK and on the island. So you're looking at 85% of the geography of Northern Ireland being covered by all 4 of the mobile network operators.
And just finally, I just logged on to the map of the north there, and there's a big massive nut spot in the middle of it there, and it takes in Mid-Ulster, West Tyrone and the East Derry constituency, which is the Sperrins region. It's just a big obvious nut spot in the middle of the north. And is the shared rural network funding, is that still available, or are you aware of any plans for addressing that huge nut spot in the centre of the north?
So the shared rural network for Northern Ireland meant that we benefited from funding for what we call partial nut spots, so essentially where there's maybe 1 or 2 operators but not all 4. So essentially the drive was to try and get the operators to share, so where one had a mast in a particular area, then the others would be able to share it, and that is what has lifted the coverage up from about 75% of all 4 to 85%, and it will increase slightly. And then of course each individual operator has got a slightly different footprint. So look, we know the reality of what people are facing when they try to use mobile, and it needs to improve. We understand that, and certainly one of the things that we can do is try and improve the level of information that people have, so they can make a better choice when it comes to choosing the particular network that's going to serve their area. So that is.
There's none available in that area.
Well, I'm hoping at least, Declan, that the information we can provide, certainly when we relaunch the checker, will be more accurate. And we've got to focus on outdoor coverage, because the challenge of predicting what indoor coverage is like whenever, if you live in a new house which is beautifully insulated, that's great, it keeps you nice and warm, but it also can keep the mobile signal out. So there's lots of challenges, and you will never have 100% coverage. It's just not possible. But we want to get the information a lot more accurate, and we've used different sources of data, not just the operators themselves. We're certainly setting a higher bar for the information that they provide us, but we're also doing our own sort of crowdsourcing data. We're doing drive tests ourselves. We're using other public services as a vehicle for road testing what the service is like. Because initially when we provided coverage data, it was can you make a phone call and can you send a text, whereas now people want to use their phone for data on the move, and that requires a very different level of coverage and capacity.
Declan, Emma.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to you all for coming in. I have a couple of questions that relate to some of the things that have already been touched upon by Patsy and Jonathan and Declan. So in terms of the infrastructure, one of the biggest problems that I've seen related to the trees as well, and I've had this conversation with NIE in the wake of that storm around what we can be doing to prevent that becoming a problem, and the simplest solution to that, in my view, is the routine maintenance and cutting of trees beyond what is currently done. And I understand that there's a cost attached to that, but an awful lot of the poles that we seen coming down and wires we seen coming down was as a direct result of trees that should never have been let grow at all. So that's the first I suppose point that I would make, or perspective that I would have on it. We had Fibrous before the committee, and like Patsy and other reps met with them in the wake of the storm, and I was very frustrated at the way that they communicated with customers, the way they communicated with ourselves, and the length of time that it took to respond to the network outages. I do have to say that in the round, and with the benefit of hindsight, they did provide a goodwill payment to customers, many of whom then went 2 months without having to pay a bill in the wake of the storm. That definitely was appreciated and was in stark contrast to other providers who didn't provide any if you would call it a goodwill payment or compensation or whatever you want to phrase it as. So I think that probably that has went some way to comforting customers who had went without connection. An awful lot of these people only ever were with Fibrous because they couldn't get a connection otherwise. So that has to be considered as well. And I think it probably would change my initial perception on how that was handled by them. Openreach, I am finding, in my time as an elected rep, there's a number of government departments, health trusts and different agencies that I deal with on a routine basis where the response is getting worse as time goes on, and that definitely applies to Openreach. I'm now in a situation, we had a very simple thing happened about 3 weeks ago in my constituency where somebody drove into a pole in the middle of the night and it left an entire road, probably about 40 houses, without any sort of mobile or landline connection. And when I contacted Openreach, which should have been a simple fix, each customer had to report it via their provider. Not possible for a lot of these people because they didn't have any connection. Talking about elderly people living miles out of the closest village. It goes back to Jonathan's point in the first instance, people that had no means of connecting anybody and wouldn't contacting anybody and wouldn't know how to. These had to be, even from myself, these has to be lodged via an app, a what 3 words app to provide a location. I give the exact specific point of the junction on the road. You couldn't have missed where the pole came down, and was asked to provide this coordinates. To me, it's not an acceptable level of customer feedback, and as a result, in fairness to Fibrus, the Fibrus customers who were affected were back on within 2 days. There were BT Openreach, EE, PlusNet customers who weren't on for 10 days. Not acceptable. And the last point that I would make would just go back to what Declan's saying there around that not spot. I take consider what you're saying there around houses, but I can attest to the fact because I live beside that area and I'm in that area regularly, and there's that what we call the B47 that connects West Tyrone and Mid Ulster. There is no mobile signal there. You can drive for about 20 minutes and have zero signal, and it is a concern, and there have been instances where there have been accidents and different things that have happened and there's no means of contacting emergency services or anyone else. So people are relying on their internet connection within their house in order to get that signal. So the house thing doesn't become as much of a problem because you can make a phone call through your Wi-Fi. But when you're on the road, you have zero means of contacting anyone. And my dad's a farmer in that area, and I know from first-hand experience that that's an issue. So I know that there are problems even with applications for a mast that would cover that some of that area between Greencastle and Drippertown, but it's something that I'd love to see resolution to. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. David?
Just,
Oh, sorry, you wanted to answer, apologies.
you raised the issue about trees. I think that's one Jason might be able, because that's the whole area of land ownership, what you can do. There's a whole set of legislation around trees as well.
I've written to Dara about it and potentially received a response from yourself.
So it's maybe, not to put you on the spot, Jason.
Well, there is obviously some degree of legislation and concerning the felling of trees. However, there really should not be an impediment in cases where there are health and safety concerns. But that's something I'll have to take back to colleagues in the department, and happily to respond to the committee in writing on that particular point.
I think it would be helpful because I know, and again, I wrote to the Minister about it. I think I submitted a question as well, and I had that conversation with NIE, and what they were saying to me was that there's an extra cost involved in doing that sort of widespread tree management that's required. But I know, again, from speaking with local landowners and farmers in the Sperrins area who have had contractors come out onto their ground to say, we're going to cut 6 inches off the top of this fir tree, and the person is saying, would you not cut 6 foot off it? And they're saying, no, we can't do that. And the farmer says, well, can I cut it? Well, you can, but if it affects that line, then you're liable. And so we have that. So it just seems to me counterintuitive, and I don't know what that barrier is, but definitely in advance of next winter, it's something we need to see resolved, because we're going to find ourselves back in this situation again.
Chair, if I may just pick up a couple of the points that Emma raised. Firstly, in relation to the customer service point, we're talking to Fibrus and lots of telecoms companies on an ongoing basis about how the storm affected them, particularly how they met their obligations. Also, the point about Openreach and communications. If you're a telecoms customer, your relationship is with the company you pay your bill to. Now, they may provide your service over OpenReach, but you have no direct relationship with OpenReach, so I appreciate that that may prove a bit of a challenge sometimes. I'm not speaking on behalf of OpenReach. I'm sure they would be incredibly willing to pick up any inquiry from an elected representative. I know that we talk to them regularly, and
See, and this is what I'm saying. At one time, and this even comes into the placement of poles, and where a constituent would say to me, I need that pole moved. You know, I'm trying to widen my entrance, or, you know, I've had a change in my business or in my home where I need. And it used to be that you would have been able to pick up the phone and you probably got a resolution. And I'm finding in recent months that that's not the case. And in terms of OpenReach, anytime I report a fault to them, I'm getting the customer has to report that to their provider, which is fair enough. So then I respond to say, well, they've done that, and I'm still not getting anywhere with them. So it sort of contradicts that because I don't find that they do want to engage with elected reps, and certainly don't want to with me anyway.
right, you can engage with us.
That will be taken on board.
And sort of picking up on a couple of things that have been said. Well, in my area, kind of fibrous, to be fair, really quickly adapted and did provide information. So, but I want to look forward a bit more positively. There was one in my area in Lagan Valley, and there was a BT pole or an OpenReach pole that had broken. The fibres were on, so fibres couldn't fix because the BT pole was there, and they ended up actually putting a pole in beside it to quickly go up. And so, I know you've said about better communication, but is there any work towards an actual service level agreement between all of them that they have to, or from the department? No.
Well, I think the whole issue of getting access to OpenReach infrastructure and their physical infrastructure access is overseen by a group called the Office of the Telecoms Adjudicator. He's the person that's set up the various rules. We know from informal conversations with Fibrous, they have said, look, if you want, we'll fix that pole, you know, because it helps our customers. But OpenReach have been very clear, no, we want to make sure that it's handled in this particular way because we don't want to differentiate how we handle other operators. The Office of the Telecoms Adjudicator, I believe, reports to Ofcom, so I'm going to ask if Jonathan wants to make a comment.
Yes, I mean, the whole process of providing access to OpenReach's network, the passive infrastructure access it's called, we introduced the rules 5 years ago. It's worked generally very well. It's worked incredibly well in Northern Ireland, actually. We have, as a result, we've got 94% of our premises are now connected to full fibre directly, and that's way ahead of the rest of the UK and Ireland. So I think, to be fair, Fibrous, if you were asking them about the day-to-day operation of that, because they've been right on the front line, and I think they would say that it has generally worked pretty well. They may have some questions about other aspects of that process, but as Trevor said, it is managed, and you know there are a clear set of rules and service level agreements and so on for how that process is handled. And if any particular provider who's looking to get into OpenReach's ducts or poles, if they have an issue or a complaint, there's numerous forums run through the telecoms adjudicator where they can bring that forward and discuss it.
Everything within the network and everything works fine whenever there isn't a storm.
Yes.
That the problem is whenever you have an event like this, then you have the problem. So Fibrous didn't have a problem with communication with them until there was a storm. It's exactly so. Whenever we met with them and chatted to them, they were talking about not having that level agreement or service level agreement or where's that effect that was allowed. You know, there was an obligation effectively between the department. It could be the other way about. It could be. It's not a one-way thing on OpenReach, but to make sure that so it's an agreement. It's not just communication.
No, it's a fair point, David. And I'll pick up just on the auto compensation scheme because it's related to that. And Jerry might want to say a bit more about the logistics of repairs and so on. Essentially, the auto compensation scheme was agreed 6 years ago. There are 10 retail companies signed up to this across the UK. Fibrous are not one of them at the moment, but those 10 companies, they basically have to pay compensation for late installations or missed appointments or delayed repairs and so on, including in storms. Now, they can recoup that money very often through the likes of OpenReach, but they pay the cost of the compensation whenever there are storm emergencies and those service level agreements fall away. and that is known by the companies that sign up to this. So,
Do we have a service? Is that agreement there between whichever provider?
well, there are service level agreements for how the likes of Fibrous go onto the OpenReach network. Absolutely, same for any company. So, but in a storm situation, and if OpenReach declares MBORC, as Kieran was saying earlier, matters beyond our reasonable control, then those service level agreements fall away, and that is a contractual process with between OpenReach and the customers that are using their network. But
The other thing, when I met Fibrous, and we're going back a few months now, but they talked about reviewing the pricing strategy. You talked about the passive, I can't remember what you said, passive something, but it was
passive infrastructure access.
So they talked about the price. Is there any movement there to review the pricing strategy to drop the price for consumers effectively?
Yeah, so access is governed on the basis of those service level agreements, those rules that Trevor talked about, and they're also based on alternative providers like Fibrous paying a fair price for access to that and a proportionate price. So as I said, Fibrous may not have necessarily any big issues about the day-to-day operation of that, but you know they're talking to us about pricing issues. We are consulting right at the moment on a new set of rules for full fibre rollout. It's called the Access Review. It'll set the rules for full fibre rollout for the next 5 years, and part of that is pricing. So I know that Fibrous are actually talking to our colleagues who are running that project, so they will have every opportunity to put forward their thoughts on pricing issues.
So just one more thing. I dealt with a customer a little while ago who had economy 7 heating in their house. This is kind of related, but not. But it comes under Ofcom, and long wave radio was what was turning their meter from on and off basically when the nighttime things, and then long wave radio was being removed. Is there? You talked there about confident that customers would be sorted. Is that? I'm just concerned that we've got more than the one that I dealt with.
Yeah.
That will effectively have no heating.
So we have, if there are any cases of radio interference, which is what that sounds like, I don't know the details.
We're turning off long
case.
wave radio. We're turning off the radio. Or they were turning off the bands or whatever was the case, and they were going to end up with it. So it's an NIE issue effectively. But is there anything in process? All I was just whenever you're here, just there's a concern that there's more than the one I dealt with. That there's customers out there who still need the old, really old technology, but will be left.
I suppose my reaction to that is that's certainly something for the electricity provider. If they're using that means to manage their network, they would also know that that meter is there in place and be able to take the requisite action.
There's no. It was just when you said I'm quoting what you said. You'd be sorted before change happens. But I know for a fact it hasn't changed, and that's what I'm saying. Is there anything there to protect the customers at the end to make sure they still have heating in their houses?
Yeah, it's a bit difficult because it's not actually a telecoms issue. I initially thought it was interference, but if it's not interference and it's
Ofcom, it's a radio. You're using radio network.
I understand, yes, but
so
but it's the use of the spectrum and if it depends on how they've implemented it. But if NIE are not able to use that, or whoever the electricity provider is, then it's up to them to look at the alternatives. We're not turning it on or off or getting in the way there in any way, shape or form.
Okay. I'm happy to pick up the details of that with you afterwards.
That'd be useful.
Just to remind that the department is doing a smart meter consultation. It's either completed or it's in the process. And that's probably where concerns like that should be directed as well.
Okay, Robbie.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you guys. Just 2 wee questions, because most of the questions or queries that I had have been covered. But we do have an increased population of vulnerable people who have to stay at home and receive domiciliary care and care in the community. And obviously, you'll know that the greater impact obviously happens in rural areas, as happened with Storm Eowyn. Is there any concurrent work with other departments like the Department of Health and the Department of Communities at a strategically high enough level to assess that as a significant risk, and then to work out the better solutions based on the evidence that is obviously presenting itself after the storm? That's the first question. And second question, I'll just ask and then I'll mute and I'll come back in again, Chair, if that's okay. So obviously there was an answer I heard at the start to one of the questions. I can't really remember the questions, but it was that Northern Ireland has a disproportionate share of the polls. So obviously we're a very infrastructure heavy sector for internet, broadband and so on. Is there any work with alternative ways of getting, particularly in rural areas, internet and broadband supply, potentially by companies like Starlink and other providers like satellite providers? I'm sure that technology is now fast catching up, if not outstripping the hardwired demand. Thank you.
I'll deal with the second one first. Just in terms of the alternative technologies, well, you know, in terms of supporting resilience, putting it underground would obviously much be more effective than through the poles and above ground. But I think the cost is estimated to be 10 times whatever else. So that sort of precludes that solution in terms of moving forward. Again, Robbie, as we have said earlier, that we are linked to a wider BDUK contract. Part of that contract was, and it was about cost efficiency, was use the existing infrastructure that was there. That's the same as moving before. So that's the limitations of or that's, let's say, the conditions that come with the funding, let's say, that we benefit. In terms of the first list, in terms of vulnerable
well, in terms of vulnerable lists, we understand there's, as mentioned earlier, so there's some work with the other utilities, and we reached out to the utility regulator to get an update on that, and they are working with the other utilities, and there's now dialogue to look at how telecoms might fit into that. I think one of the issues is trying to ensure that the lists are coherent and accurate as well, and it's also about interest of the citizen as well. You know, it's just to be aware of that issue. On the use of alternative technologies like Starlink, OneWeb, we know that BDUK is undertaking some trials of these technologies. I believe that there's a trial about to take place on Rathlin Island looking at the use of satellite technology for dispersed rural communities there. I believe it's just at a high level assessing, requesting request for proposals stage. But that's being led by BDUK, and they've also been looking at other trials of using that type of technology in remoter parts. As regards resilience, we understand that there was to be a programme of informing citizens about how to improve resilience. It was through a UK website called Protect, I think, was about to be publicised. However, I think at that time then a general election was called. I understand that the PR plans around that are being reassessed, and there'll be some work involved in promoting that side to make people aware of resilience as well for their communications.
Through you, Chair, if I could just point out that Robbie, the 10% of polls covering 3% of the population is not the fault of the telecoms companies. It reflects the fact that we have a very rurally spread population, and they are simply going to the houses where people have built. That's why we have got more polls. In terms of the alternative sources of coverage, you mentioned Starlink, and we are increasingly providing radio spectrum to allow more use of what you would call low orbit satellites. So Starlink and other providers are available. There used to be back in 2018, there was 2,000 of those satellites in space. There are now 10,000, and we're providing spectrum for more. So yes, hopefully more alternatives will be there to provide a little bit more resilience.
Thank you very much. Finally, Sinead.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for all your answers. And you've covered most of the things that I would want to discuss. But I suppose Storm Eowyn was a really extreme adverse weather event. But increasingly we are seeing globally extreme events that take place. And I suppose an awful lot of lessons have been learned as a result of the storm itself, and how organisations can work more effectively together. I happened to be in Spain when the power went down over just after Easter, and it was pretty scary. It was a national emergency, but in the face of that type of an event, and based on now the experience of Storm Eon, are you making any contingency plans if something as major as that everything is out, everything? There is no part of the country on, and does any of the mobile networks, maybe this is a question for Jonathan, does all of the mobile operators have generators? And how effective and how long can they be in place if something just goes complete failure?
I'll pass to Jerry first, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. So, are we taking the lessons from elsewhere? Absolutely. And within hours of Storm Eon landing, we were on the phone to our counterparts in Comreg, to other, France, Netherlands, just to understand what the impact was. But again, we have to take a look back to see what were the complications, what were the issues. And I'd like to just dwell on some of the complications that we had locally. It is very challenging to turn up to a site, and we've often heard the example, a pole has fallen down. When Openreach turn up, it's actually 6 poles, and 3 of them belong to the electricity company. And just the health and safety implications of getting there, never mind moving the tree, never mind a chainsaw is not going to look at the tree because it's 5 foot wide or something, and they need forestry equipment. So it suddenly gets very complicated very quickly in terms of scale, by virtue of the fact that it was an unusually strong storm, and the directionality of the wind also had a significant impact there. In terms of the national impact, we have already resilience guidance. So Ofcom publishes guidance to operators in terms of their design, in terms of their ability to recover from particular events, in terms of making sure that they have specific programs in place to minimize and mitigate the impacts. Specifically for mobile, there is nothing that says there must be generators at all sites or anything like that. And our key consumer harm, so to speak, is about availability to 999 or 112 services. So that is the ultimate backstop. And there are capabilities in place there that make sure that if you are on one operator and that operator's network has failed, you can get your 999 emergency services access through an alternative operator's coverage. So that's already there and already in place. We are taking the lessons of what happened in not just here but elsewhere as well, and looking at what does that mean for particularly mobile services moving forward. In the good old days, if I can call it that, the fixed services were that backstop. We're now seeing the mobile services more and more. So we're looking at that, and also the implications of increased satellite coverage as well. So that's going to be a programme of work and a future consultation, but I assure you it's absolutely in progress, and we're very keen to see the results of that.
Yeah, I suppose really it's just about learning the lessons and kind of future-proofing it, and making sure that we have a national emergency response if something like that actually does happen. And I think Storm Eon kind of shone a light on that.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your representations, and more so thank you for all your hard work in recent weeks and months during a difficult time. The committee really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. AOP is we've lost the era quorum.
Now, members have any other business they want to raise at this stage? If not, can I thank everyone for their attendance, and we'll now adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Senate Chamber. Sound